Hello everyone, this is Professor Любимцева in GPY 100 Physical and Environmental Geography. Our topic this week is Introduction to the Biosphere. This is lecture 8 and it is based on chapters 10 and 11 in our textbook. This and the following week, our learning objectives include to understand and explain the fundamental processes of the biosphere, especially to understand flows of energy, water, and nutrients, and biogeochemical cycles that connect biosphere with all other spheres, such as the hydrosphere and the atmosphere and the lithosphere, and to discuss the influence of climate on biogeography and define ecosystems and global biomes. Biogeography is the branch of physical and environmental geography which is interested in the geographical pattern of plant and animal species, and biogeography is a cross-disciplinary field which is bridging biology and geography. Biogeography also requires understanding of ecology, which is the study of interactions among different organisms in the ecosystems and the relationship between the ecosystems and everything that inhabits it. An ecosystem is a functioning entity of all the organisms in a biological system, as well as all its abiotic environments, such as water, for example, or landforms, are generally in equilibrium with the input of energy and materials in a particular environment. Ecosystems function and interact through a variety of different processes and flow, and they are interacting also with the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and cryosphere through energy flows, through the water cycle, as well as through the biogeochemical cycles, such as cycles of nitrogen, cycle of oxygen, carbon cycle, phosphorus cycle, and sulfurous cycle. One of the most important biogeochemical processes in the biosphere, connecting it to the atmosphere, is of course photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the production of carbohydrates through the chemical combination of water and carbon dioxide in green plants and also in phytoplankton. Sunlight supplies the energy which is effectively stored in carbohydrates in plants, and it can be consumed by animals, while oxygen is released into the atmosphere. There are three groups of plants, such as C3, C4, and CAM plants, with different photosynthetic pathways. They all have different efficiency of metabolizing carbon dioxide and storing the energy in the form of carbohydrates. Some plants can take advantage of higher amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we are experiencing right now as a result of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. On the other hand, many other plants are simply unable to take this extra intake. So climate change is going to significantly change biodiversity and decrease biodiversity of our planet because not all plants are capable to adapt to those higher concentrations of CO2, even though CO2 is a food for plants. As I mentioned already, ecosystems and the entire biosphere are connected to other spheres through the biogeochemical cycle in our Earth system. Atoms and molecules move through ecosystems under the influence of both physical and biological processes. The pathway of a particular type of matter through the Earth ecosystem comprise a biogeochemical cycle. Biogeochemical cycles can be either gaseous or sedimentary, depending if they're happening only between the biosphere and the atmosphere, or if they're also happening within the lithosphere. This diagram from our textbook provides some examples of the most fundamental biogeochemical cycles, such as the cycle of hydrogen, the cycle of oxygen, and the cycle of carbon that connect the biosphere with the atmosphere and the lithosphere, as well as the hydrosphere, through a variety of different processes. One of these biogeochemical cycles is carbon cycle. It is extremely important for understanding climate change and many other processes in our Earth system. As you can see, there is a variety of carbon sinks. Carbon is present in the atmosphere, in the terrestrial vegetation, in soils, in the surface ocean, in the deep ocean, and in the sediments at the bottom of the ocean. By far, the largest carbon sink on Earth is the deep ocean that contains about 38,100 gigatons of carbon. In comparison, our atmosphere contains 750 gigatons of carbon, and vegetation contains about 610 gigatons of carbon. As you can see from this diagram, carbon is constantly moving from one thing into another through breathing and photosynthesis. Carbon is moving from the atmosphere and into the atmosphere, and from the terrestrial vegetation and phytoplankton on the surface of the ocean back into the atmosphere. Some of this carbon is migrating into the soils and then locked there for several hundred, sometimes thousands of years. Some of that is moving then into the ocean, and ocean, as the most powerful carbon sink, locks this carbon there. In fact, if we didn't have terrestrial vegetation, and especially if we didn't have the ocean, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere would be significantly higher. The danger, of course, is that we are also experiencing growing carbon emissions from human activities. So burning fossil fuels, cement production, and transportation emissions are adding significant amount of carbon into the atmosphere, and only part of this carbon is further traveling into other carbon sinks. So this is something that we need to understand as we are continuing conversation both on the biosphere and on the atmosphere and climate change. Ecosystems include both abiotic and biotic components. Examples of abiotic components could be landforms or water, for example, ocean, lakes, rivers. Biotic components include plants, animals, and also humans. Abiotic and biotic composition and structure of ecosystems is determined by the state of all interrelated environmental factors, and of course it is determined by climate and landforms and soils, and more it is influenced by human activities. Changes in any of these factors, such as nutrient availability, temperature, intensity of light, grazing intensity of animals, or changes in the species population density, will result in dynamic changes to the nature of the entire ecosystem. And so, as we saw in the previous chapter with climate change, we are experiencing right now movement of our ecosystems. Our ecosystems are literally moving north as our climate is changing due to human activities. So on these maps on the bottom of the slide, you can see the shifting ecosystems in Midwest and in the Southeast and in eastern part of the United States from the state in 1960s to 1990s to the projected biogeography of our ecosystems by the end of the century as a result of climate change. There are strong connections between climate change, loss of biodiversity, and land use and land cover changes. Current land use practices significantly worsen climate change because we are losing those carbon sinks. And in turn, land is increasingly damaged by climate change, and our agriculture is experiencing significant impacts of climate change. Land is a net carbon sink. It's very important to understand that vegetation and soils are carbon sinks, and if they are destroyed, this carbon is released back into the atmosphere, exacerbating climate change. Land-based climate solutions can reduce carbon emissions and remove carbon from the atmosphere, and land-based climate solutions have many other benefits beyond curbing climate change. That's why organic agriculture, small-scale local agriculture, simply eating local are extremely important. This is good not only for our health, it's also good for the biosphere, and of course, it also contributes to combating climate change. Some land-based climate solutions can actually carry significant risks and trade-offs. For example, land-based climate solutions that require large areas could threaten food security and exacerbate environmental problems. For example, if very large areas are used for producing biofuels, this can be actually not, it looks like something beneficial for our economy, but this is not necessarily beneficial for biodiversity, food security, or climate change. So it's important to understand the land is both a powerful sink of carbon, but it's also an emitter of carbon dioxide emissions. It's a net carbon sink because land produces about 5.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide and it sequesters about 11.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So the net benefit is equal approximately all annual greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. We need to manage this resource very wisely, and we need to protect our vegetation, we need to protect our wetlands, we need to protect our soils because those are very powerful carbon sinks. But also, of course, they're very important biodiversity resources. They're resources of our food, our medicine, and vegetation, of course, is also providing us with many very important ecosystem functions and ecosystem services beyond just alleviating climate change. As I mentioned already, all biotic and abiotic components within ecosystems are interrelated. Ecosystems are powered by solar energy. The solar energy is then photosynthesized by either phytoplankton or by plants or by green algae. All life forms that have chlorophyll, the green pigment that allows photosynthesis. And then those carbohydrates that are produced by green plants or by phytoplankton can be consumed by herbivores. And of course, these herbivores can be consumed by carnivores. And so this consumption then is leading to movement of energy to detrivores, the decomposing species that also play very important role in the cycle of life. And through decomposition, these chemicals are going back into the atmosphere, and some of those nutrients is going back to soils. And of course, then soil is producing more nutrients that are necessary for green vegetation, and this in turn is enriching the atmosphere and the biosphere as well. So as you can see, all components within the ecosystem are tightly interconnected. Many of the most important relationships between living organisms and their physical environment are controlled ultimately by the amount of available incoming energy received at the Earth's surface from the sun. And this is why understanding of climate zones is really fundamental for understanding biogeography and the distribution of ecosystems around the world. It is this energy of the sun which helps to drive biotic systems, and the sun energy allows plants to convert inorganic chemicals into organic compounds. This diagram illustrates some typical processes of inputs and outputs of energy and matter in a typical ecosystem, including movement of solar radiation from sun to plants, dispersal of plants, migration of animals, erosion and deposition of soil organic matter, long wave radiation going from the ecosystems back into outer space, through the atmosphere, the heat distribution through the environment, again, the dispersal of plants, migration of animals, erosion and leaching of soils within the ecosystem. All organisms within the ecosystem are connected through the food web or food chain. Here is an example of the Great Lakes food web. At the base of the food chain, we would find primary producers such as algae, for example. Primary producers are also green plants, certain bacteria that contain chlorophyll. They convert solar energy into organic energy. And then above the primary producers are various types of consumers who ingest live plants or the prey of others. So there are many layers of those consumers. And then, of course, Further, this matter and energy is decomposed by the decomposers such as fungi, bacteria, molds, who make use of those energy, decomposing already dead plants and animal tissue, and then releasing chemicals back into the atmosphere or back into the hydrosphere and soils. As plant and animal species evolve in various climate zones and various environments, they develop a variety of adaptations to the amount of light, moisture availability, temperature range within a particular environment in order to flourish. They adapt to different climate zones and also different altitudes. Some of these physical environmental factors include climatic factors. Plant and animals adapt to certain amount of moisture, temperature, light, wind. They also adapt to certain geomorphic factors such as slope steepness, slope aspect, topography, altitude, as well as the so-called edaphic factors. Those are factors related to different types of soils, soil texture, amount of nutrients in soils. All this determines what kind of plant and animal species can inhabit different ecosystems. Many places on Earth share similar climatic conditions despite being found in geographically different areas and on different continents. As a result of natural selection, comparable ecosystems have developed in these separated areas even they are very far away from each other. These major ecosystem types are called biomes, and they're more or less corresponding to climate zones, but as we will see, they are not the same as climate zones because there is a variety of other factors such as geomorphic and edaphic factors that is affecting the distribution of ecosystems in addition to climatic factors. The geographical distribution of the various biomes is controlled primarily by such variables as precipitation and temperature, but also amount of nutrients in soils, altitude, exposition of slopes, steepness of slopes, and so on. At the global scale, all ecosystems can be organized into major biomes such as tropical rainforest, tropical savanna, desert, chaparral grassland, temperate deciduous forest, temperate boreal forest, and Arctic and alpine tundra. Let's look at some examples of global biomes. Most of the classified biomes are identified by the dominant plants found in their communities. For example, grasslands are dominated by a variety of annual and perennial species of grass, while deserts are occupied by plant species that require very little water for survival or by plants that have specific adaptation to conserve or acquire water. They are known as xerophytes. The diversity of animal life and plant forms characteristics of each biome is generally controlled by abiotic environmental conditions and the productivity of the dominant vegetation. In general, species diversity becomes higher with increases in net primary productivity, moisture availability, and temperature. And of course, we have the highest biodiversity in tropics as a result of this. Net biomass productivity is the difference between gross productivity, which is production of plant material by photosynthesis within an ecosystem, and respiration. Net productivity represents the amount of organic matter which is produced by a plant or at the scale of the ecosystem by the entire ecosystem. Net productivity is closely related to a number of environmental factors such as climate, landforms, and available nutrients. Examples of biomes with very high productivities include tropical rainforest. This diagram shows us the changes in mean productivity per unit area for different biomes. The forest biome consists of close-growing trees with leaf canopies that generally overlap. The overlapping canopy prevents much light from hitting the forest floor. The shaded condition keeps forest soils relatively moist. Forests require ample amount of annual precipitation to support their growth, and we can find different types of forests around the world. Tropical rainforests occur in broad zones outside the equator. Annual rainfall, which exceeds 2,000 to 2,250 millimeters, is generally evenly distributed throughout the year. Temperature and humidity are relatively high through the year, and there are very few seasonal changes. Flora is highly diverse. A square kilometer of tropical rainforest may contain as many as 100 different tree species as compared to only 3 or 4 species in the temperate zone. The various trees of the tropical rainforest are closely spaced together and form a thick, continuous canopy, some 25 to 35 meters tall. Tropical ecosystems often include epiphytic orchids and bromeliads, as well as vines, lianas, as very characteristics of the tropical rainforest biome. Some other common plants include ferns and palms. Most plants are evergreen with large dark green leather leaves. Another major forest biome found on many continents is boreal coniferous forest. This moist, cool, transcontinental coniferous forest, or taiga, lies largely between the 45th and 57th north latitude. The climate of taiga is cool to cold, with more precipitation than in tundra, which occurs mainly in the summer because of mid-latitudinal cyclones. The predominant vegetation of boreal biome and are needle-leaf evergreen variety tree species. The understory is relatively limited as a result of the low light penetration onto the soil level, even during the spring and fall months. Today, unfortunately, much of the northern coniferous forest of Europe and eastern part of the United States has suffered from acid rains, which is a direct result of burning fossil fuels, primarily from burning coal. Acid rain forms when sulfur compounds combine with water in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid, and then they fall in the form of the rain. Acid rain can severely damage the structure of pine needles, making them vulnerable to invasion by other diseases and organisms. And this is what we see, for example, in the Appalachia, in Midwest, and in many other parts of the world. Soils in which the plants grow are also acidified, and this is also leads to acidification of the underground and soil water. Here is an example of coniferous forest affected by acid rains in the eastern part of the United States. Another common forest biome is the Mediterranean woodland. The Mediterranean woodland is a sclerophyll forest consisting of low branching trees with small, hard leaves and gnarled, thick bark. The Mediterranean woodland is found on the western coast of continents in mid-latitudes and bordering the Mediterranean Sea, for example, in Spain or in southern France or in Italy or in California. It is closely associated with the Mediterranean summer subtropical climate. Another prominent forest biome is mid-latitude broadleaf deciduous and mixed forest. The mid-latitude broadleaf deciduous and mixed forest of humid mid-latitudes contain evergreen as well as deciduous trees, reaching height of 15 to 25 meters. As we move away from the global forests, the savanna biome is characterized by an extensive cover of grasses with scattered trees. It is a transitional biome between those dominated by forests and those dominated by grasses. The savanna biome is associated with climates having seasonal precipitation accompanied with the seasonal droughts. This is the biome which is associated with changes from a fairly short humid or rain season with a longer dry season. Plants in the savanna have adapted to the long dry season in a number of various ways. For example, the baobab tree that you see on this picture stores water during the rainy season in its huge trunk and then uses this moisture during the long period of drought. Many grasses and trees of the savanna flourish during the very short wet season and then go in the state of dormancy. Grasses turn brown and trees lose their leaves to reduce the loss of water by transpiration. The next biome is grassland. The grassland biome is dominated by grasses of a variety of species, all having adapted to the summer drought common to their semi-arid habitat. Grasslands can be found in mid-latitude, and they have been exploited for a very long time, perhaps more than any other biome by humans. 99% of the United States tall grass prairie and 70% of the mixed grass and short grass prairie in most states have completely disappeared, and 85% of the state of Iowa was once covered by native prairie, and today it's only 1%. Grassland or steppe can be also found in southeastern Europe, in southern Ukraine, and northern Central Asia, in parts of China. Again, similarly to North America and similar to Argentina, most of grassland today is heavily occupied by agricultural lands. The next biome is desert. The desert biome has the lightest cover of plant compared to any other biome, perhaps with the exception of tundra. Here, the lack of moisture really prevents plants from establishing themselves in those harsh climate conditions. Plants in deserts develop many unique adaptations to the extreme heat and also to the lack of moisture, and those plants are known as xerophytes. Desert biome can be found both in tropical climates and in mid-latitudinal climates. And finally, the tundra biome is found in the Arctic areas and also in the high latitudes, which are also closely associated with tundra climate. Notable areas of Arctic tundra can be found in North America, in Europe, in Asia, and of course in Greenland, as well as in Antarctica. Short grasses, flowers, grass-like sages, along with covers of mosses and lichen are the dominant forms of vegetation in the tundra. Seasonal frost disrupts root systems, preventing support for tall vegetation. And the main limiting factor here for vegetation development is really the temperature, not the humidity. There is plenty of moisture here, but the growing season is extremely short. And this is different from the desert, where very sparse vegetation is limited by the lack of water. Tundra features permafrost or permanently frozen ground at a certain depth, and even though the surface of tundra might be thawing during the warm summer season for a short period of time, the ground underneath remains frozen. So these conditions are known as permafrost. With global warming, we know that permafrost starts thawing in many Arctic areas, and as it thaws, it releases additional emissions of carbon. Alpine tundra can be found at high altitudes in the mountains, and it can be very similar to the tundra that we see in high latitudes in the Arctic. So here microclimate is a very important control over the distribution of plant species, as well as slope and exposure also controls availability of light and moisture. To see some examples of global biomes, please see this video. As always, please remember that the quiz based on Chapter 10 is due this week, Friday by noon, and this lecture covers both Chapter 10 and Chapter 11, so the quiz for Chapter 11 is due the following Friday next week, also by noon.